So today what I'd like to talk about is the one aspect of CB radio that makes CB radio superior to ham. And you might be thinking to yourself, Rick, you're crazy. There isn't any aspect of CB radio that makes it superior to ham, but I can prove to you that there is one. And that is the selection of antennas that the CB guys have had access to from the very beginning. So let's take a look at a browser. And we'll start out with probably the most common antenna that I've ever seen, at least growing up in Northeast Ohio. There were hundreds of these things up in the air, and that's the lowly Starduster. And it was a simple ground plane, quarter wavelength, stinger on top with quarter wavelength radials, 3 of them sloped at about 45 or 50 degrees or 60 degrees, I can't remember, but they're sloped down, and that's just mainly to get the SWR where you want it at about 50 ohms. And these were good antennas, and like I said, there was hundreds of these things in the air where I grew up. And the only fault that I could see on these is that there were better choices that had more gain, and also these radials tended to fall off during thunderstorms, windstorms, so they weren't the most reliable antenna made, unfortunately. And the really cool thing is that these antennas are still available. You can still buy them. So I think Stereo still makes it. Anyway, you can still buy these antennas today if you want to try one out. But like I said, there are better options available. I never owned a Starduster. I had one of these, though. This is a Shakespeare big stick. And these were good antennas. These were half-wave dipoles. And they were basically sleeve dipoles. So the bottom half of this antenna had a cylindrical tube over top of the coax, and that was basically the bottom half of a dipole, and then the top half was just a basic quarter wavelength CB whip. And just like the Starduster, these are still available. Shakespeare is still making antennas. However, they call this antenna a marine antenna now, and it's still for 27 megahertz, so I'm sure that it would work just fine on CB, but you can still buy them. This one just happens to be on West Marine's website, and I'll put a link down below. In fact, I'll put a link for all these antennas down below. But this was a great antenna, being a half-wave dipole, had plenty of gain, and had no problems with it. And it was replaced more or less by this antenna. This is the Antron 99. And this antenna is infamous in that a lot of people swore by them and a lot of people thought they were garbage. And I've owned one of these. This was my omnidirectional choice when I was running CB back in the 80s. And I had this antenna on a coax switch, and I also had a 4-element or 5-element beam, Yagi. So I would search for stations to communicate with on this antenna, figure out where they were, rotate the beam around, then switch over to the beam. And I thought they were a good antenna. A lot of people say that they're really no better than a big stick, but it seemed like it worked very well for me. One of the cool things about this antenna is it's easily adjustable. It's got 2 rings that you can loosen up and spin those things higher or lower to adjust the frequency of the antenna. And I thought that was kind of cool. So easily adjustable. They will adjust to 10 meters, no problem. So you could buy this antenna and make it a 10 meter omnidirectional vertical antenna if you wanted to. But once again, very good antenna. This one's right channel radios. I'll put the link for that down below. And here's one of the more infamous ground plane antennas, omnidirectional antennas that you could purchase back in the day. Still available. But this was the high-gain Super Penetrator. This thing had a tremendously good reputation. And of the ones that I had a chance to communicate with, so, talking with stations that own this antenna, they seem to perform very, very well. And this is a 5/8 wave ground plane, and very good antenna, very big antenna. These antennas are 22 feet 6 inches high, so 22 and a half feet in length, where like a Shakespeare big stick would be like 18 feet. probably the biggest ground plane that you could get. And still available. This one's still being made by High Gain. High Gain is still in business. They're still making antennas. So I'll put the Amazon link to this one down below. Very good antenna. Very good on receive, especially. So, on to some other antennas. So High Gain, I mentioned, is still in business. And this particular beam that we're looking at right now is called the Long John. And you can still get this. If you go to DX Engineering right now, you can purchase one of these. And they have a 24-foot long boom. It's not a small antenna. It's a very, very big antenna. And I had actually the baby version of this thing. So the Long John is part number 410. I had the 411 beam, which was also a 5-element beam, but it was only a 17-foot boom, so the elements were kind of close together. The 4-element 10-meter Yagi that I have in the air now is made up of pieces of this antenna. So the boom length is the same. All I did was take one of the directors off and retuned it for 10 meters. So I had this beam back in the day and I used it on CB, but then when I got into ham, I converted it into a 10-meter beam, 4-element beam. And the reason I did that is because whenever you put 5 elements on such a short boom length, the bandwidth will suffer. So the bandwidth of the antenna wouldn't be very good on 10 meters. So I took one element off to give me better bandwidth. But it's a very good beam. It works very well. It's a 4-element beam. The Long John is still being sold. Like I said, you can get these at DX Engineering today if you wanted to. And they don't call it a CB beam anymore. It's now called a 10-meter beam. But still available. Still a great antenna. So High Gain, like I said, still in business. Still a good company. I like their products. I like the use of the hairpin match. I think that's a better option than a gamma match. And then we'll go to Wilson. So Wilson made a number of CB antennas back in the day. Probably the most infamous was known as, well, let's start with this one. This is the Wilson Shooting Star. And they call this an 8-element, but it's really a 4-element Yagi. They have 4 elements in the vertical plane and 4 elements in the horizontal plane. And two runs of coax would come off of this beam and it would go into a switching box. So you could switch between horizontal and vertical polarization, because back in the day, mobile CB was a big thing. So if you were trying to communicate with somebody in a mobile far away, you could switch back to vertical and probably pull them out. And then if you were working DX or working another base station, you could switch to horizontal, and of course horizontal would be much quieter. So that would be the preference. These were great antenna. They had a cubical quad reflector in the rear, which made this antenna work very well. So all of these elements, the 2 directors and the driven element, were standard Yagi type elements, but then the reflector was a quad element, which made them work very well. That's a 4-element, or they call it an 8-element. This would be the 6-element, or they would call it the 12-element laser beam. And this was a mystical antenna. Huge gain off of this antenna. 17 decibel gain over isotropic is what they call it, and I believe every word of it. These were a monstrous antenna. They were huge. I can't remember what the boom length is. 31 feet. So a 31-foot boom. Tremendous amount of gain. And quite popular. I would see 4 or 5 or 6 just driving around my neighborhoods. And awesome antenna. Laser beams were legendary. I guess that's it for Wilson. We'll go on to Avanti Corporation. So when you say Avanti, of course, the first antenna that pops to mind is going to be this one here. This is the astroplane. And this is basically a folded monopole antenna. And they were very good antennas. They worked very well. In fact, this is the antenna that I patterned my 2-meter antenna off of. So my 2-meter antenna is a scaled down version of this and works very well. And they made a beam version of this too. They called it the Astro Beam. And I had a friend that had one of these antennas. They work extremely well. So they just added a director and a reflector to this same antenna. They got rid of the capacitance hat on the top. And this had to be fed by a unique feed line because the impedance was incorrect if you just fed it straight with coax. But there was a quarter wavelength version, I think it was a quarter wavelength of 75 ohm coax in front of this to make the impedance work, come out where you wanted it to be. But this is a great antenna. The only drawback to this antenna was it was vertical only. So there was no way to run this in a horizontal that I know of to make it work as a horizontal antenna, but as a vertical it worked very well. The biggest advantage of this particular 3-element beam was it was very compact. Did not take much of a rotor to spin this one. And they had some other antennas too. The Sigma, the PDL2 was a beam that they had that was very popular. And there's the Moonraker. Okay, so the Moonraker, made by Avanti, was another of these switchable vertical polarization, horizontal polarization beams that was very popular. And it was very much like a Wilson shooting star in its makeup. So it had a quad reflector in the rear, and it had 2 directors in the vertical plane, 2 directors in the horizontal plane, and then vertical and horizontal fed elements as well. And it worked just like the Wilson shooting star in its operation, and also a very good antenna. In fact, I would have to say the Moonraker was probably more well known than the Wilson antenna was. Everybody that was in the CB had heard of the Moonraker antenna. So there you go. That's a good selection of the ones that I grew up with. So the Starduster, the Shakespeare Big Stick, which is still in production. Both these antennas are still in production. The Antron 99, which you can still buy as well. Super Penetrator, which is still available. And high gain beams. High gain doesn't make all of the selection for CB antennas that they used to make back in the day, but you can still get some of them. And then Wilson, of course. I don't think you can buy these anymore. The website that I'm using for the Wilson and Avanti is worldradiohistory.com. I'll put a link for that down below. But there you have it. If you guys know of any that I missed, please put them in the comments below. And the reason I mentioned this and the reason I wanted to put a video out on this subject is because many of these antennas can be reworked for 10 meters. And you can tune them to work on 10 meters just fine. 10 meters and 11 meters aren't very far apart. You just shorten the elements slightly and off you go on 10 meters. So it worked great for that. And they're typically very cheap. So an 11 meter antenna, if you can find it, usually they're typically cheaper than the 10 meter ham stuff. So if you can find an old beam or an old omnidirectional ground plane antenna and repurpose it for 10 meter use, it's a cheap way into the 10 meter hobby. 10 meter is great. I've mentioned this before in my other videos because you only have to be really about 16 feet off the ground for the antenna to perform very well. And if you take a 4-element beam and put it 16 feet off the ground, you've got something. That's a DX antenna that you can be proud of. When it comes to CB and antennas, it kind of reminds me of the saying, beware the man with only one rifle. He probably knows how to use it. So if you're only on one band of frequencies, and even if you were free banding and going above channel 40 or what have you, still that slice of frequency is pretty narrow. And if you can put up 2 antennas, you put up a omnidirectional ground plane type antenna, and you put up a Yagi, and you can invest a lot of money in those 2 antennas, and that covers the entire frequency band that you're going to be using. So that's the big advantage of CB over ham. You know, with ham, oh goodness, look at the frequencies that we have to put up antennas for if we want to be even remotely comprehensive in the frequencies that our radios cover. We go from the 70 centimeter band all the way up to 160 meters and everything in between. So there tends to be compromised antennas with ham. All the end feds and all the off-center feds are compromised antennas. Even the multiple band Yagis are compromised antennas. And they'll sacrifice some gain on each band to be able to cover more bands. So with CB, you don't get that. You can tune your antenna to be maximum gain on one slice of frequencies, and that is the one aspect of CB that beats ham hands down. So there you go. As always, thanks for watching.